the Get a Mac ad campaign, the kind of Mac versus PC white background two guys. The repetitive nature of these ads, how they touch on various USPs but ultimately make the same point and you walk away with the same feeling, is very reminiscent of work that's done when we deploy a strategic framework called a message box. And it's something I want to explore today with you guys through these kind of cheesy old Mac ads. First category is us on us. Second category, us on them. Third, them on us. And four, them on them. It really, really helps, and it's a really widely used tool, so I really want to share it with you guys. I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you. Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. To kick us off today, I wanted to bring you guys back to the year 2007. I personally was not fully conscious yet, but I was gaining awareness quickly. So naturally, I was fully plugged in to the launch of the cultural juggernaut that is the live action Alvin and the Chipmunks reboot. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. If you haven't, it's incredible. The squeakquel also goes off. Love, love, love Alvin and the Chipmunks. I particularly love Alvin. I feel like he's just cheeky. He's got that cool red hoodie. He's like the epitome of cool, or at least he was to me as a child. Theodore, it's not giving. Simon, who cares? Alvin is obviously, in my opinion, the leader for a reason. He's got really good ideas. He's got the confidence to pull it off. He just really made an impact on me. And I do think this is partly because of the performance turned in by Justin Long, who I feel like is the millennial darling and sort of epitome of that laid back hoodie, cool guy vibe that was going around in that period of time. It's so funny to me that, like, yeah, non-confrontational dudes in jeans and a hoodie were genuinely the epitome of cool in culture for a while. I feel like we could blame a lot of it on, like, The Office and also a then sort of blooming culture in tech, with, like, laid-back young founders in jeans. It's super interesting to me, and we could probably talk about it for a whole podcast, but that's not what this episode is about. And personally, I don't even really like that kind of vibe. I think that, like, it is cool to try, even if that sounds a little bit dorky, it's very cool to try, and I think the effort always deserves to be celebrated, so that, like, really cool guy vibe doesn't resonate with me now. But it was obviously a big hit back then, which kind of brings us to the subject of today's episode, and something I find so funny. I wanted to do an episode on the Get a Mac ad campaign, which, if you don't remember, I'll get into it a bit later, but the kind of Mac versus PC white background two guys. When I started researching this episode and I realized that Justin Long of Alvin and the Chipmunks was the Mac guy, I had to get up and go outside. That is so funny to me. And then I put the timeline together because I watched all of these Get a Mac TV spots, and I found that they ran between 2006 and 2009, and the first installment of the live-action reboot of Alvin and the Chipmunks came out in 2007, like I said. So Justin Long was booked and busy in only a way that mattered in those specific years. Do you know what I mean? It's like he was so hypey for that period of time. To land the Mac versus PC ads and Alvin and the Chipmunks reboot is crazy work, and I feel like we don't acknowledge Justin Long's contributions enough. But in case you have been living under a rock and you are not familiar with the Mac versus PC ads, to kind of break them down for you, they featured 2 actors. The first one, Justin Long, Elvin, he played a Mac, and then John Hodgman plays a PC. And the setup of this ad is always really similar. They've got basically the same music playing. It's 2 dudes, white background. Justin is kind of giving real life Elvin in that he's very casual, usually in the way that he dresses, and he just has this like air of cool about him. Whereas John is positioned as the PC and a very boring guy. He's usually in like beige old suits that don't seem very interesting or compelling, and he's always kind of scrambling, and he's a little bit of a dork. So we're really setting up a visualization of the products as well as a consistent way for people to engage with the brand and the angle. One thing that they hit over and over and over again is Mac's ability to bring value to your life beyond work, which is really interesting to me. So a lot of the main USPs for Macs are around like using iMovie, which is really funny to me. I remember seshing iMovie as a kid. My best friend, shout out Monica, as a child, and I would make like Lego iMovies. So I can back that up. Apple does bring a certain level of creativity to the functionality of a computer. And they really focused on the way that PCs were just sort of like relegated to this office worker type of boring spreadsheets only. You're just using a PC because you need to access Microsoft. That's sort of the whole point. Like I mentioned, I did watch all of these spots to prepare for this. And one thing that was so funny to me is that at some point they introduced like a couples therapist into the Mac versus PC canon, which then forces us to confront like what is the nature of the relationship between Mac and PC in these commercials. Why do I also kind of ship them? I think they would be a really nice couple. And I do feel like surely somebody out there has written Mac and PC fan fiction. So if you have or you know of a good one, please send it in. I would love to read it. I want to know. I love a bit of fan fiction. Drop it in the comments. I would be obsessed. Anyway, moving on from Mac versus PC fan fiction and their couples therapist. The like big picture thesis of these spots is that Macs are cool, PCs are not. And it's not even a conversation anymore between like which of these products is better. They make Mac the only option and PC the default. You get stuck with a PC, which is so genius and so smart. I listen to probably the podcast that I myself listen to the most frequently is The Office Ladies, which is really fun. My partner and I fall asleep to it every night. It's very comforting. But a few weeks ago, I heard Jenna, who played Pam, talking about how she actually did shoot one of these spots and it never ended up being aired or published. According to her, they would film a bunch of these Mac versus PC ads with like different celebrities, different angles, and then they kind of focus group and only run the best ones, which is something you can only do when you are as big as Apple. But I think it's really, really cool. The like repetitive nature of these ads, how they touch on various USPs, but ultimately make the same point and you walk away with the same feeling is very reminiscent of work that's done when we deploy a strategic framework called a message box. A message box is sort of a tool in your creative strategy belt. And it's something I want to explore today with you guys through these kind of cheesy old Mac ads because I think it's a really valuable tool and a really great thing to know how to do. And it's super easy as well and super accessible, which I love. What is a message box? I've gotten this question a ton. I've mentioned this before, but I retired from politics a few years ago and I started just working in the ecom DTC space. And a message box is actually a tool that is used in almost every political campaign. It's super simple. It's incredibly effective. It's giving Occam's razor. The simplest solution is probably the best. It's just, yeah, really easy to deploy, but very helpful. To describe it to you guys very simply, I will be sharing like a sort of template message box on LinkedIn. Catch us there. But to describe it to you guys here, it's just sort of simply 4 different quadrants. So if you think of like one big rectangle, you split that into 4 quadrants, and it kind of works to help you create your main message for a campaign. Oftentimes in politics, we talk about ground game versus air game. Your ground game is small potatoes, it's sort of local issues and conversations that people have on the doorstep, whereas an air game is what's going to hit on a national level. So what are the like localized radio spots talking about versus the high level campaign national vision? So a good message box, if you're looking at a campaign or brand holistically, it should in theory lead you to your air game headline. You shouldn't know what that is going into it. You should be looking to discover. All you need to create a message box, if you want to do it right now as you're listening, is a piece of paper and a pen. I know, scandalous. You can also like do it in a Google Doc. I'm not going to judge. I love a piece of paper and a pen, so that's just my personal taste. But yeah, to create a message box, it's essentially just organizing your thoughts around your product or brand into 4 different categories, which I'm going to introduce right now, and then I'll detail out later a little bit more. So the first category is us on us. Second category is us on them. Third is them on us. And 4 is them on them. I have said these combinations of words a million times in my life, but it really, really helps, and it's really, like I said, widely used tool, so I really want to share it with you guys. But something that I did notice, so you'll notice in the structure of those categories that they're very adversarial in nature. And that is like an adjustment that I faced when I came over to the old private sector, is that the competitiveness that was drilled into me after years of mentors and colleagues sort of showing me that you needed a specific, almost rival to communicate things clearly, was not really the norm when you start thinking about brand and marketing. It kind of reads as aggressive, but just keep in mind, it actually ends up being a lot less sort of like us versus them and political in nature when you break it down for a brand. But what's really interesting to me is this idea that communicating around a shared enemy is just always going to be more productive, and it's going to be like an easier point of entry, where if you're just presenting ideas with no sort of agitation, it's harder to capture people's attention, and it's harder to influence their behavior as well. We talk a ton in marketing about problem agitation and solution, and at some point in my career it just clicked that I was doing the same work in 2 different ways, so why not merge it? So sometimes when we think about problem agitation, it is so conceptual. We might be working with a brand or a product that like we can't pinpoint an exact competitor brand. We can't pinpoint like an exact reason why someone might not purchase. So that makes this work a little bit messier, but all the more necessary in my opinion. If you think about Snuggies, there's no like clear adversary there. The main problem that the Snuggie campaign presented us with was that when you are sitting on the couch and your hands are tucked under the blanket, it's really hard to take your hands out of the blanket and eat your popcorn, which is totally relatable, I guess, at the time. Happens to me every week, is kind of what Snuggie was hoping, I guess, would happen. But obviously that's not really a real problem, and obviously Snuggies don't really exist anymore, which, clear correlation there. So if you think about the difference between Snuggies, who are kind of obsolete now, and Macs, there's a lot of difference in product, but it's so interesting that Apple and Mac specifically were able to really represent their main competitor in a personified way to create that environment of a rivalry, which is so cool and so interesting. It's like when you look at the Get a Mac campaign, you can really clearly see the echoes of a message box, which I think is really cool. It's like without a foundation through a message box, or however Apple came up with this campaign at the time, these ads could have really easily come across as being smug and stupid and kind of braggy and not being capable of influencing any behavior, but instead they really struck a chord and they really formed a mass public opinion around these 2 products. I want to go through each quadrant that I mentioned earlier of a message box to really give you guys an idea of how to put one together and the kind of things you want to be pulling into your message box. So starting with the quadrant that I always start with when I'm putting one together, which is us on us. It's the simplest quadrant of a message box, and in my experience working with brands, in the e-commerce world, it's what most people come to the table sort of already prepared with, or at least they think they're already prepared. It's simply just describing who you are according to you. Just us on us. It's that simple. So it's like here that Apple would have really fleshed out who the character of the Mac was going to be. Surely they had a Pinterest board. If Pinterest was like up and running in 2006 with like Jim Halpert and maybe Cody from Surf's Up on there. If you know Cody, if you know Surf's Up, again, please let us know in the comments. I think that's a great film that's also been sort of forgotten and blown to the wayside. Anyway, in this space, you want to avoid like rewriting your brand guidelines and instead think of it as an opportunity to like present an elevator pitch of the brand. Don't just like copy and paste what's in your Insta bio, in your brand guidelines. Really think about it from this perspective of like, how do we talk about ourselves? And something that I also say a lot to brands when we start doing this is don't write your notes in a way that is conductive to a typical agency brief or something like that. Write your notes in real words that real human beings use, because that's going to help you with the end product hugely. So the trick to a good message box, in my opinion, is that it's succinct as you're putting this information together. You should do a lot of research and a lot of thinking, but what you actually put on the paper should be quite short. It's helpful to brainstorm with a team as well around this and then sort of narrow things in. But what ends up in the document, like I said, it should be very short and sweet. I usually aim to have about 5 bullet points in each quadrant. So small, I know, for someone who likes to gap and likes to write. But when working with brands now, when I'm putting together this quadrant with them, I try to answer these questions, these 5 questions in this us on us quadrant. And it tends to be kind of my 5 bullet points. So first one is what's at our core? What's like the actual soul of the brand? At the time for Apple, you can see from like the way that they were marketing iPods as well and like headphones and stuff. The core soul of Apple at the time was creativity and inspiring that creativity in its users, empowering them, like I said, to live their best creative lives. That was really what was at their core. Who founded this thing is kind of an interesting thing to think about if you do have a compelling founder story. And I think it really does matter in the us on us conversation. Like, why did we make this product and who made it? So really trying to flesh that out again in really plain language, just to help you get some distance from it and figure out how you would actually talk to a regular person about the founder story is a very interesting challenge most of the time for brands. Next question would be so simple, just what makes the product really, really good? What are the things that people love? I tend to, when I'm doing the research phase of a message box, really dive into reviews, and I really dive into organic reviews to see what parts of the process of unboxing and using the product are people just genuinely excited for and mentioning a lot. Next question is, what's the aspirational word of the brand? What's the sizzle? So again, for Apple, it would probably be something like very simple, creativity. That's sort of the aspirational word. It's the aspirational state of being that we want people to associate. So really getting into the nitty-gritty of what do we want people to feel like they're unlocking when they buy this product. And then the last point that I try to fill out in the Us on Us section is just where are we headed? What is the future of this business feeling like? What's it looking like? Just so we can kind of almost hint at it and continue to keep the momentum in our messaging, which is very important and I think kind of gets like left behind sometimes. But where do we want to go? I'm not talking about your like MER targets. Shut up. No, I'm talking about like where do you want the brand to sit with people? Where do you want it to sit in their minds? Where do you want it to sit physically? Do you want to move brick and mortar? Like, what are your actual plans? And trying to describe those again very quickly, not necessarily so that you can share them with people, but so you can understand how to plug them into your messaging in a really cohesive, comprehensive way. The next quadrant I'll talk about is us on them. My favorite, let's get ready to fight. This part is so particularly interesting to me and fun because it's very difficult to do when you're talking about brands or you're talking about specifically brands in the e-commerce space. It's much different than previous seasons of my life where my work would revolve around a really clear-cut them, and I would already go in knowing like who I was talking about. Part of the fun, I think, in taking message boxes over to the world of DTC is that we can kind of morph them a little bit, and them can become a little bit more conceptual. So who is your actual like adversary is the easiest way to think about it. And something that I find really tangible and helps kind of shake this thinking loose when I'm working with brands is if someone doesn't spend money on your product, then what are they doing with their money instead? Where's it going? That's your enemy, babe. That's your them, really. So in this quadrant, Apple would have really developed their PC character, because them for them is not necessarily just PCs. You know, it's like whatever. People are always going to have preferences that are based on price, based on loyalty. But what they were trying to do is go after a subset of people who were not die-hard Microsoft PC people and give them a reason to switch over. So like I said, they would have been really fleshing out like who that character was, who they look like, and trying to tap on the fears that they might have realized when they were filling out a sort of us on them section. Another example of trying to figure out who the actual them is in your message box is, say you start like an artisan soda brand. Coca-Cola is not your them. Coca-Cola is not your number one prime adversary. When people are making a purchasing decision, the small artisanal soda brand that you've created isn't actually going to be in the conversation. It's famously going to be a Coke or Pepsi situation, right? Like, you're just fundamentally different. And I think that's something that gets lost on a lot of founders in the early days, is that you're not competing with those big guys right away. So stay away from creating a unnecessary David and Goliath dynamic in the way that you're bringing a product to market. Instead, if you're starting that small artisanal soda brand, which if you are, also hit me up. I love small artisanal soda brands. That sounds like a lie, but I genuinely do. I love like a really good cream soda. It's like a small batch. I don't know how to describe it. Anyway, if you're starting that small artisanal soda brand and your go-to-market plan is, say, setting up at local farmers markets, your them is going to be another like fun drink that's available at those markets, because that's probably what people are spending their money on instead of your product. So maybe it's like a little old lady's lemonade stand. That's your them. That's the kind of thinking that you need to do to actually make a message box effective. And then say your go-to market plan is based around DTC and e-com, then your them is going to be categorically different because you're not, in the same environment. So I think that it might have to revolve more around dismantling friction when people are buying consumables online, beverages specifically, really tough sell. So them in that case is going to look a lot more like dismantling a bias than an actual person. I think something to point out right now in the episode as well is that you should never have the same message box for the entirety of your lifespan as a brand. It should shift. If in fact you're not having to recreate a message box every quarter, you're being kind of lazy and you're probably not seeing any growth. So really make sure that you're not thinking about this as like a finite document, but rather something that's like helping grow and scale in the moment and will help you get to that next tier where you'll have to redevelop and think about it again. If you think about it, like if Apple had done an iPhone versus BlackBerry version of this that was as successful, they would have eventually had to completely pivot because we no longer are really contending with Blackberries, which is sad. I wish that I had a Blackberry. I like the little buttons. I like the way they sound. But it's interesting to think about, like, you could do a bunch of R&D, create that message box. It could go really well. And then because it goes really well, you make it obsolete. So again, don't be afraid to like get really niche with your message box initially, because it should change over time. So when I'm looking to fill in that us on them section, I usually look to answer these points, these sort of 5 bullet points. Again, really succinct, really easy. But the first thing I ask is, what do consumers already hate about them? So what are the annoying pieces that people are already not too happy about? And really diving in again on the other side, looking at reviews for a competitor, if it's a specific product, really trying to figure out like what is the friction and where's the easiest point of entry is like a much easier way to phrase that. Second piece is like, what do we offer that they do not? and try to be as subjective as possible, because I think a lot of the times when we own a brand or we work with a brand day in, day out, we think that we're offering something and we're not. We're too close to it. So really step outside of yourself and even your team and go to actual consumers and see what they are saying. And again, really try to tie this into reality and use plain language. The next question, this one's always really interesting, but what is something that we, the us in the equation, what is something that we pity about them? This one's very interesting, and this definitely does come from my days as a political strategist, but I think really narrowing down on finding almost like a point of mercy, and I think pity is the best word. And the reason that I wanted to use the Get a Mac campaign to explore message boxes with you guys is because I think this is a really great example of how articulate pity to put yourself almost above the competition, to fundamentally sort of change the conversation from, again, do I want a PC or a Mac, to I am stuck with a PC while I save up for a Mac, or always making it not the chosen option but just a default is so smart. And the pity piece plays out a lot in these Get a Mac campaigns. The PC guy is always like kind of fumbling around. He seems a little bit lame. It definitely triggers a lot of empathy in me and makes me want to buy a PC just to make him feel better. But it also does just, like I said, really reinstate the conversation, and it puts Mac in a position where we're not even talking about them as equals anymore. We're kind of putting PC a full couple of steps below them, which is really interesting. So that pity piece could be really lethal, sort of depending on your brand. And when you deploy it in a smart way, like Apple did, it'll be hugely successful. Next is, what are we sort of perceiving as their fatal flaw? So most brands, even when you work with them, they probably do have some kind of fatal flaw from a product point of view. What is it not servicing? This is not the same as what do we offer that they do not, because the fact of the matter is we might not be addressing this fatal flaw, but it's just good to write it down on paper to keep it top of mind and to kind of monitor it again in a way. And then the last point I use in the us on them section is, what emotional benefits come from making the switch from them to us. This one is very interesting to me, and I think a lot of the juice of this section lives in this cup. I don't know. Sometimes I get really lost in analogies when I like make them up on the spot when we're recording. But anyway, this what emotional benefits come from making a switch from them to us is so interesting, because this is like fundamentally why someone would buy your product instead of doing the them related activity. So the emotional benefit, if we're looking at the Get a Mac spots, is that they are going to empower me to do more, live more freely when I buy a Mac. I'm going to be allowed to fully realize all of my creative dreams and passions. And that is the true emotional or just straight up benefit to going with a Mac instead of a PC, which is a really powerful message. And again, not everyone's gonna have such a cut and dry message, but that's why these ads are such a great example. The emotional benefit of switching is made so clear to us in every single spot. Even the physicality of the actors is really interesting to note from sort of a psychological point of view. Like the PC guy is always very tense. He's always worried. He's like slumped over. He just doesn't seem confident, where Mac is cool and confident, just like Alvin from Alvin and the Chipmunks, Justin Long come through, and we can really start to see ourselves shift into that Mac side of things versus PC when we watch these ads and we think about purchasing a Mac. So yeah, the emotional benefits piece, so interesting and so important to not forget when you're putting one of these together. The next quadrant is them on us. If you can't take it, then you can't dish it out. This section is important because you're basically preparing your own defense strategy in a lot of ways, but you're not necessarily, because we're not talking about a political realm anymore. I am retired. We're talking about something that's a little bit more, there's a lot more ebb and flow to it. And there's never a need to, hopefully, for you guys, I don't know, there's never a need to defend your brand and your product in the same way that there's a need to be on the defense when you're running a political campaign. That's just common sense. But why this section is so important is because it's all about understanding how to refute these friction drivers without having to be attacked first, which is actually a huge strategic advantage. We're not waiting for our competitors to bring these issues up, we're addressing them already in how we're communicating in general, which is really important. So this line of messaging, it's not going to necessarily feel super present at the surface. Again, the Get a Mac campaign, really great example of this. It's something that they would have had to understand before actually scripting and filming these and even coming up with the concept of these ads. They'd really have to understand how to create an impenetrable message through the campaign, and you need to just know what your weaknesses are. Like, it typically does pay to pay attention to your own weaknesses before the market or competitor can point them out for you. I like to say Delulu is the Salulu for them on us. Just really stepping back, feeling unattached from your brand and letting it rip. Same, you want like 5 points or so. I don't have like a really firm way that I go about finding these. I mostly just start looking at sort of like competitor ad libraries and their websites. I start scrolling through as much as I can to kind of really understand how they might be already positioning us in a negative way. I find that super helpful. Something I would also really caution against here, like a lot of the times, naturally, we get our back up a little bit when we start thinking about our own issues as a brand, but I'd really caution against trying to bring any like R&D or future solves into this quadrant. Like I said earlier, your message box is going to shift throughout time. So there's something about your product and brand that you're looking to change, but it's not going to shift before you're rolling out this campaign. Then that's negative feedback and you need to be realistic about it within this quadrant, in my opinion. All right, the last section of your message box is them on them. This last section, very important, and again, it might not necessarily feel really visible in the content that you end up producing based on this message box, but it is incredibly relevant. On a weekly basis, for any of the brands that I'm actively working with, I do creep competitor ad libraries, I creep websites, I'm looking at reviews, I'm looking at their organic socials, I'm subscribing to emails of competitors. Whatever they make available to me, I record and track. And I find this particularly helpful to ensure that I am differentiating a brand. I think that a fatal flaw for a lot of marketers is that they overwhelm themselves in sort of the waters of the competition and they start seeing, well, this is working for this brand, so I'll maybe try it for mine. But I think that's oftentimes a mistake because the biggest value you can bring is being something different. When it starts to come down to we're offering the same thing, we're producing the same ads, it's just going to come down to things like price and what's the last ad they saw. So really important to actually differentiate yourself through that research, which I think is fun. And instead of devaluing your brand by doing what everyone else is doing, you are showcasing net new USPs, you're doing it in different ways. So yeah, really make sure that when you're soaking in content and information from competitors, that you're not then just spitting out sort of a worse version of it on the other side. So what I do and what I feel like Apple kind of did in preparing to launch Get a Mac is that you take in all the information and then you almost try to do the opposite, or you try to do it in a different way, which is really fun and can be really sort of entertaining. So a lot of the messaging around getting a PC at the time was about really effective working experiences with their Microsoft stack. And so Mac said, that's great, that's wonderful. Microsoft is in fact a great tech stack for the modern computer worker. I don't know what we would call it in 2006, but they then, I think, because you do that kind of research, are able to produce ad spots that directly call out, you can run Microsoft on a Mac. So it's like, instead of trying to build up their programs as being the same, they differentiated the product and the Mac operating system first, and then they started to bring in this idea that you can also just run your Microsoft stuff. So you can still have those benefits and more, which is really cool. So I feel like hopefully that's clear. It's just about being able to acknowledge what those competitors are saying and then almost like yes and them at their own game. And it's about knowing those competitors so well that their brand is almost part of your own strategic thinking and framework. So to fill this quadrant in, you basically just redo the us on us section, but you try to put yourself in the mind of your main competitor, which again, very interesting, very fun to me. It's just like a different way of thinking about things that you don't usually. Usually I think brands and marketers get stuck on the us on them section, but really diving into the them on them and like, how are they presenting these things really helpful. And I would just use the questions that I laid out in the Us on Us section to fill out them on them, but just flip the script. So now that you have a message box, what is the next step, and how do we go from this type of research and strategic development to a winning campaign like Get a Mac? I personally, I already said this, I think, I do like to create physical message boxes. I think for me, there's something about writing pen and paper that really gets my creative juices flowing. I think it also then becomes somewhat like a multimedia exercise. You can kind of tape stuff to it and whatnot when you execute things in a physical capacity, which I love to do. But that's just me. Really, as long as you have the ability to add text to a document somewhere, you can make a message box. I've made them on my iPad. I love my iPad. Sometimes I'll make a message box on my iPad or like the foundations of it. It's just, like I said, it's such an accessible tool, and it's so funny to me that it's like been so widely used in political campaigns for so long, but nobody really talks about it or brings it into other spaces. Also, like I said, I will be posting a template over on LinkedIn for you guys to leverage in your own planning and campaign strategies. So you can print it out, you can overlay your own text, do whatever you gotta do. I like to personally think about the creation of my message box as early research. I'm not like compiling evidence to prove out an existing idea. What I do instead is I approach it with objectively a very expansive curiosity, so that the research itself and the market itself actually help guide me to the thesis statement of the message box. So for example, if I were to guess what the one-liner or the thesis of the Get a Mac message box was, it would probably be something along the lines of, there's not even any competition, get a Mac. So what would have happened if Apple was using a message box is they would have filled it out, all those quadrants that I just talked about, and then you just have to step back and you have to absorb all the information that you put together. And then that's when you can come up with something like, there's not even any competition, get a Mac. Because you can see and understand that the lowest barrier to entry is starting to retrain people's brains around how they're thinking about this decision between what kind of computer to get. And you have to kind of go through the motions of a message box, I think, to get there in a way that's confident and strong. Once you have this message box and once you have that headline, like I mentioned, you are empowered to be incredibly consistent in your communication. So that's why this type of exercise is really important. It just, again, empowers you to feel confident and think of campaigns in a really holistic capacity, and it should really help you be more strategic in the messaging you're putting out. And I do think nowadays this is particularly important because we need more content than ever. I say this all the time, but we need more content than ever to make brands work, but it needs to be good and it needs to make sense. And having a strong foundational message box allows you to more content with more confidence because everything's kind of tied to something that you feel really good about because you put the time in to really think strategically about what you're saying. If you've never used a message box before, I really hope that you try it out. It's really fun. Sometimes I make them like about nothing. Like I'll make them in my personal life. Don't ask me how. I won't tell you, but I will use them if I'm like overthinking an issue. Crazy, I know. And like I said, I use them actively all the time in the work that I do with brands at Pilot House, and so does the team. They are just enormously helpful. It's one of my favorite tools. I do one for every specific campaign I'm working through, specific brands. It's just always going to be really helpful. And like I said, it's so easy, which I love. I feel very clickbaity. I'll probably name this episode like the secret political strategist tool nobody wants you to know about. And it's simply writing things down and researching with some guidelines to that research. But yeah, if you do have any questions, genuinely let us know. I'd love to help you fill in a message box. And like I said, we will post a sort of default framework on LinkedIn, so you can save that down and start creating your own. I really hope, again, that you try this out. It's so helpful. It provides me a lot of confidence in the work that I'm doing, and it's just fun. I might be a nerd, but it's just fun. Hopefully you really enjoyed the episode today, and whether you listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you give us a subscribe and a rating. Let us know again if you have any questions, if you start putting together your message box. And like I said, when we put the episode live, we'll put a default version of a message box that you guys can start experimenting with. And thank you so much for listening today, and I'll see you guys next week.